So I just want to welcome you to Oral and Written Language, understanding the differences and implications for teaching, especially for our English language learners. We are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Claude Goldenberg, who is a native of Argentina. His areas of research have centered on promoting academic achievement among language minority students, particularly those from the Spanish-speaking backgrounds. He currently works on promoting research, policy, and practices to enhance literacy and academic development among English learners. And we are so excited to welcome Dr. Goldenberg to share with us his thoughts about oral and written language, especially for our multilingual learners. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon, very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for inviting me to speak to your group again. I love what you all are doing, and I feel honored to just be participating. So thanks very much. As Sharon mentioned, my PowerPoint is in your Google box, your Google bucket. I'm sorry, I feel like such a boomer. Um, I'm working my way around all of this, and I would really want to encourage you to download it if you're interested. I mean, you're welcome to take any screenshots you want, take as many notes, whatever, record. I think this is being recorded. Yep, and transcribed. Um, but there's a lot of information I want to provide, and I don't want you to feel like you got to, you know, type crazily. Everything that you see on the screen is going to be in the PowerPoint presentation. I was telling Sharon that I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through everything, but there's a natural stopping point. I call it my Netflix moment because I kind of take you off just to the edge. And if you're really interested in seeing what happens when you go over the cliff, then you have to download the PowerPoint. But I really recommend you watch it in presentation mode because there's some, really cool animations that I think you'll probably appreciate. Anyway, that's enough about that. I'm going to be talking about, as Sharon said, oral and written language, understanding the differences and the implications for teaching, and especially for English learners. It is relevant for all students, whether they're learning to read and write in a language they already know, or for English learners who, by definition, are learning English as an additional language, typically a second, but it could be a third, it could be a fourth. And it doesn't have to be English learners. It could be Polish learners if they're immigrants to Poland. It could be Khmer learners if they're immigrants. The idea is that when you're learning to read and write in a language that you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, there are some things you need to be very, very aware of in your instruction and your curriculum and how you approach providing opportunities to these students. So that's what I'll be talking about. Now, I have some resources that I want to alert you to. Sorry, I don't mean to advertise my own stuff, but I recently started a Substack. And in that Substack, I have a sort of an extended discussion of this topic. And it's a two-parter. Oral language is for hearing, written language is for reading. They're not the same thing, and there's part one and part two. I was going to make it just one part, but I can't help it. I had so much to say, I had to break into two parts. Otherwise, I would try people's patience, which I try not to do unless it's strictly necessary. And it's there in this Substack that I recently started called "We Must End the Reading Wars Now." And if you're interested in that topic, or even if you're not, but just want to see what it's about, I mean, feel free to dip in. If you subscribe, that's great. It's all free. There's no paid and free part. It's all free. So it doesn't cost you anything to check it out. And there are additional resources in the references that I'll mention. So before we get started, I want to say a word or two about bilingual education. And as I'm sure all of you know, bilingual education is, the single most controversial issue in the education of English learners, and it has been for, three-quarters of a century. And bilingual education is desirable really for many reasons. Long-term programs can help promote bilingualism and biliteracy. And this knowledge base around bilingual education, which is controversial, it's incomplete, just like any knowledge base is incomplete. But there are some important findings there and some important questions that are waiting to be answered. But it's part of reading research. So I get a little bit miffed when people, particularly advocates for bilingual education, advocates for English learners, say that the research on reading or science of reading, if you want to use that term, which has become kind of a lightning rod, they say it's all about English monolingual speakers. And it's not just true. It's just not true because there is bilingual education research. There's also research in the societal language, research on English speakers learning to read and write in English. I mean, that's part of the knowledge base as well. But it's part of reading research, and we really do no favors by ignoring it under the guise of, well, science of reading, as some of my colleagues in the EL space say, is bad for English learners. It undermines them. Uh, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but it's just not true. It's part of reading research. And if you're not familiar with that research, then you're really missing an important part of some of the things that we know that we can claim. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of English learners don't have the benefit of bilingual education and the reality on the ground. And I'm a big fan of reality, right? Don't leave home without it. The reality on the ground is that most English learners have to become literate in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. And that's true even if they're in bilingual education, because a lot of kids, in fact, most kids, I think all kids, even if they're in bilingual education, they're also going to be learning to read and write in English. They may not do it from the time they start kindergarten, first, second grade, depending on the kind of model that you're in, but eventually they will be learning to read and write in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. So what I'm going to be talking about applies to all English learners as far as I can tell. But I don't want anyone to walk away from this presentation thinking that I privilege English only instruction or English medium instruction. I'm just speaking to what is really the, the experience of virtually all the English learners in our country. Bilingual education is an important topic, don't get me wrong, but it deserves its own space, and I don't want to sort of kind of squeeze it into something that is really about a different kind of situation or different kind of context. So maybe at some point we can talk about bilingual education. I think it's important to know this research to the extent possible and the history of bilingual education. So I have in the references a couple of pieces that I've done with one with a student, one with a colleague, that if you're interested, you can, find out more about this very important area of research, policy, and practice. Okay, so enough about that. Um, so I want you to think about this, and this is going to be an audience participation thing, and I'm going to monitor the chat, and I know who's here. No, it's okay. This is California. I'm in California. It's a safe space, right? I want people to feel okay and comfortable. There are no wrong answers. There's some answers that may be a little righter than others, but there are no wrong answers. And I want you to think about and put in the chat, if I can find my chat button, there it is. And I want you to put in the chat just some thoughts. No dissertations, please. What are these children doing? Communicating, whispering, speaking and listening, observing and whispering, interacting, sharing, listening, speaking, sharing secrets, whispering. Okay, okay. I like this for, 5, 4. See, I used to be a teacher, so I know some of these tricks. 5, 4, 3. Boom. Okay, good. All right, very good. Lots of good answers. Oh, I should have put this up here a minute ago. Okay, right in the chat. You did that. Okay, now, what are these children doing? Now I remember to do that. Right in the chat. Reading and writing, writing, reading, processing. Okay. A couple more minutes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're good. Okay, now, here's what I want you to think about. How is what these children are doing here similar to what these children are doing here? How are they similar? Write that in the chat. Receptive, expressive, involved communicating, learning how to communicate, expressive and receptive. It's all a language activity. Forms of communication, receptive, productive. Okay, expressive, okay, taking information, sharing information. Okay, now, how are they different? Put that in the chat. This oral is written. Okay. Someone was reading the title of my presentation. Synchronous, asynchronous. Aha. Expressive, receptive. After communicating orally, using speaking and listening, or is it shown on the right, using literacy skills to read and write? Okay, good. All right. So here's the question that I want you to answer in the chat. Are there differences in how the skills, listening and speaking versus reading and writing, are acquired? Differences in how the skills are acquired. You can use learned if you prefer. Sometimes there's debates about whether it's acquired or learned. Choose your verb. So put either yes, no, IDK, I don't know, or 1, 2, 3. Or if you have another answer that's not covered here, feel free to put that in. I want out of the box thinking. I always like to encourage, I like my boxes, but I also like out of the box thinking. Okay, 1. I see yes. The yeses are like running away with it. Okay, time's almost up. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the right answer is yes. The right answer is yes. There are differences in how these skills are acquired. Okay, so let me give you a brief history of oral and written language. First of all, speech, which is how language is communicated orally, human speech evolved with humans at least 300,000 years ago. Now, there's some debate about this. No one was around to record it, to make a TikTok. Hey, but around 300,000 years ago, maybe 500,000. There are elements of it, maybe sooner than that, but a long time ago in human history. But print, written language, notice they're both language, as people pointed out in the similarities. But oral language way preceded the appearance of written language, much more recent, about 5,000 years ago. You might have heard of cuneiform, the Sumerian written language, or hieroglyphics, the Egyptian written language. They are called logographic or ideographic. The languages were represented by concepts, by figures, pictographs, sometimes they're called. So the languages represented concepts. About 5 years ago, these written languages emerged. And then phonetic written languages are even more recent, about 3,500 years ago. And we got to thank the Phoenicians for phonetic, because phoneme is a Greek word for clear sound. And when we talk about phonetics, phonemes, phonetician, well, you can thank the Phoenicians through the Greeks for that. Now, we also know that there's a biological predisposition toward speech, but there's no predisposition toward print. I mean, it's really interesting to note that evolutionary developmental biologists have discovered that human speech is the aural, A-U-R-A-L, signal that most gets infants' attention. Now, of course, if you make a loud bang, they'll startle. That's a form of attention, but that's really a kind of a psychomotor response. But as far as attention that you consciously attend, and infants have consciences. They're capable of purposeful behavior. And human speech is what gets their attention the most of all the oral signals. But there's no such predisposition to print. You don't get any attention. Now, there is some evidence, right, that very sharp contrasts get infants' attention. You probably heard about that. Some of you probably, depending on when you became a parent, probably read that research. And so you put high contrast things above your child's crib because that got their attention. You thought it developed their eyes and their ocular motor and so forth. But as far as sound, human speech is what gets most of their attention. Print doesn't have any meaning. Plus, consider this, there are no alingual societies. There are no known societies that don't have a language, that don't speak to each other orally. But many alliterate, not illiterate, alliterate societies around the world. There are dozens of societies around the world that speak to each other. I talk, you listen, sort of, sometimes depends. You talk, I listen, depending. But these societies, dozens of societies, don't have any written language. It just doesn't exist for them. All of which suggests that orality, oral language, which is transmitted through speech, is kind of like the basis of communication. And then print, written language, came next. And that's true in our evolution as a species and also in our individual developmental trajectories. You've heard the phrase, possibly from Louisa Motz's very important book, speech to print. That describes what literacy means or requires. You got to go from speech, sound, to print, written representation. Now, what we know, to kind of sum this up, is that we're born ready to understand and produce oral language, speech. Our brains are ready to go at birth. Now, of course, this is with exceptions. Generally speaking, there are children with developmental delays where this doesn't apply. But by and large, for the vast majority of the human race, human population, our brains are ready to go at birth to receive, process, eventually come to understand oral language, speech, and then be able to produce it. But we are not born ready to understand and produce written language, print. So, to use a technical term here, what needs to happen, as we say, under the hood? Right there. Well, in the simplest terms, the necessary brain circuits have to be built. Now, full disclosure, I am not a neuroscientist. Sometimes I don't know the difference between my earlobe and my prefrontal lobe. So all that I'm saying here, I've gotten from neuroscientists that I've read, studied, fortunate enough to know and talk to. But here's the view under the hood, the schematic of the brain, where you see the green involves regions involved in spoken language, right, where you hear it. Notice that the red, this here, the phonemic representation, the phonemes, the sounds, remember, thank you Phoenicians, thank you Greeks, is part of the regions involved in spoken language because hearing it is how you get it. That's how you get oral language. So the phonemic representation in the, I'm not even going to pronounce this, the phonemic representation in this portion of the brain is located in the regions that are involved in spoken language. But then look at this. The visual cortex, which is where the signal needs to go, if you're reading, because if you're reading, you're looking at written language, printed language. That message, that signal, that cue, call it what you want, has to go to the visual cortex to be processed. And there's an area here called the visual word form area, which is where the words and the phonemic signals come in. And look what needs to happen. They need to be connected. The phonemic representation's already in there, but you got to put the visual part into and connected with the regions involved in processing language. So what happens is that learners who know the language, and this quote here is from an article that's in the references that I strongly recommend. I mean, it's kind of tough reading. It's not exactly, beach reading or wherever you do your leisure time reading, but I've learned a tremendous amount from the things in the references, and I would strongly recommend. They're basically PDFs, and they're behind paywalls. I feel like I should apologize. So I have PDFs. If anyone is interested in reading some of these, email me. I'd be happy to send you a PDF. Just don't tell the publishers, because for some reason they don't like it when I hand out free PDFs, but that's okay. It's our little secret. So this diagram here is taken from a website by an eminent neuroscientist from France, Stanislas Dehaene. And this quote here is from one of the references from the Journal of Neurolinguistics. And what they say is that learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind, and that's a technical term, bind orthography, which is the spelling system, right, which you have to see, to an already present knowledge of phonology, the sound system, the sounds of the language, and semantics, the meaning carried by language. And what happens, and this is a quote from Dehaene, is that a vast brain circuit is transformed when we learn to read. All of these regions, you see these regions in red, increase their activation and specialization. They're there, they exist in the brain, they're used for whatever they're used for, but they increase their activation and their specialization as you acquire literacy. And then a massive bundle of connections link the visual areas here with regions involved in phonological coding. And as a result, here's the key thing here, we gain the ability to access the spoken language system through vision. I cannot tell you how important this is. This simple phrase is, and I don't want to get over the top or dramatic here, but it is profound, because what reading requires us to be able to do is to access the spoken language, which we can kind of naturally and relatively easily do just by hearing and listening and being involved in a language speaking community, even if it's just one or two people. You want to access the spoken language system through vision. So you access spoken language through one sensory system, hearing, audio, and then you have to shift and access it visually through a different sensory system. Very, very important and very profound. And what happens is that a reading circuit is created in the brain, connecting the sounds of the language to the written representations of those sounds, and then to the meanings of the sounds and the representations as represented by words. Words and syntax and all those aspects of oral language. You have to be able to access all that written stuff and connect it to your oral language. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the speech to print connection that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago is the gateway to literacy. That to become literate, your brain has got to bind speech sounds, phonology, to print, orthography, and then to meaning, semantics. There's no getting around this. Now you might ask, what about people who are visually impaired? What about people who are auditorily, hearing impaired? Well, there are some workarounds for them. There's Braille, and there's various other things for audio handicapped, limited people, but they're imperfect. None of the individuals that have visual or auditory challenges or issues, generally speaking, are able to acquire literacy at the same level of fluency and processing speed that individuals with who don't have those limitations. So there are workarounds, but they're imperfect. Literacy requires the ability to process print at the speed of sight. This is another very important phrase by Mark Seidenberg, the neuroscientist. And what that means is eventually, if you can't look at a word and recognize it immediately and be able to read a sentence and a paragraph so that it makes sense, and that's one of the reasons that fluency is so important. If you can't process print quickly, automatically, eventually fluently, you'll be hampered in your ability to process and understand. Because what you need to do is be able to connect word meanings, the grammar of the language, syntax and morphology, the relevant background knowledge to comprehend, using your metacognitive skills, thinking about it, activating those processing. Am I getting this? What's going to happen next? And all of that with fluent integration of everything. You need to be able to fluently integrate all those systems. So let's talk about becoming literate. I made up this word oralite because we don't have any analog to literate. So I just made up oralite. You can use it if you want. I'm waiting for Webster's to determine it. Webster's just came out with the word of the year, polarized. Maybe one of these years they'll come out with oralite as the word of the year. I'm not going to hold my breath. So becoming oralite is basically a natural, easy process with some exceptions. We're wired for it right out of the gate. Learning is also natural, right? There's this thing about learning to read is unnatural. Well, learning to read is not unnatural. It's not like you're born wired to do it, but learning is natural. Well, I mean, that's, if learning weren't natural, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, but it's harder. Learning is harder. And why? Well, because the wiring has to be constructed in the brain. And then for that to happen, something needs to happen outside the brain to facilitate that happening. So think about this. Some of you might be thinking about Scarborough's rope, which is kind of a different kind of metaphor, but just think about this because I like travel metaphor. I've been traveling a lot since I retired from Stanford, so I've got a fondness for travel metaphors. Think about literacy journey as starting from two distinct paths, right? Starting from different places, but having to converge to the destination. What's the destination? That is the house of literacy, ladies and gentlemen. The house of literacy is the destination toward which we are moving. So being a little more abstract here, what are the pathways to literacy? Well, there are basically two pathways: communication with a meaning focused and foundational skills with a code focused, right? You can see how this sort of maps on to Scarborough's rope if you're familiar with that. So what are the foundational skills that we need to travel along the code focus path? Phonological awareness, letters and sounds, phonics decoding, encoding for writing and spelling. On the communication path, we need language, oral language, knowledge, experience, comprehension. And then it's all kind of tied together with fluency, that reading at the speed of sight. And then what are the practices to travel the paths to literacy? What do we have to do outside the brain, in schools, at home, in communities? Well, in order to help students travel the foundational skills path, we have to teach them how to manipulate the sounds and words, engage in activities to learn letters and sounds, and teach them explicit teaching of phonic rules, how you apply those to decoding words. You want to engage in dictation to practice hearing sounds and writing the word. That's called encoding. And then what about to travel along the communication path? Well, you want to do read alouds that are at a level higher and more challenging and more enriching than when they can read on their own, which initially is very little and eventually becomes more. But for a period of time, they depend on read alouds for really high level text with vocabulary and knowledge and things that they can't access visually yet, but they can certainly access auditorily. And you want to have discussions and conversations. You want to expose and teach the new vocabulary. You want to provide lessons and activities to gain knowledge. You want to use films and other media. If you're one of the schools that are lucky enough to still do field trips So if you can't do field trips, there are opportunities for exploring the world outside of the school. Real world activities all contribute to communication and all contribute to moving towards traveling to the house of literacy. So what about English learners, you wonder? I've been talking here for what, like half an hour? It's okay, I'm ready to hear about English learners. I mean, did I sign up for the wrong room? No, you didn't. You're in the right room. Because guess what? English learners have the same brain. Now, we all have differences and variations. I mean, the human body is basically very, very similar, absent anomalies, of course, but everyone's different. Size, shape. We all have, again, absent anomalies, same kind of limbs, same number of eyes, and so forth. But there's variation, and there's variations in bilingual English learners, English only speakers across the board. But here's the thing that we want to think about. It's the same brain, but remember this here, the learners who know the language rely on, it's the same quote. Here's the key thing. Learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind orthography to an already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. Well, that's where the English learners come in. That's why they're called English learners. They don't already know the language. They don't already have an already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. Now, some have some. We know that English learners, they're by no means a homogeneous population. Some come in knowing basically no English. Many come in early, whatever scale system you use, early intermediate, intermediate. So they know some, so they're not like blank slates. Well, no kid is a blank slate for that matter. So there's variation there. But the thing is, you cannot assume that your English learners, whether they're beginning or intermediate, have the same level of familiarity with the language that you're teaching them to read and write in. They don't know, or is that familiar with the sounds of the phonology? I mean, there's some sounds in English that literally do not exist in other languages, and not just Spanish. Spanish and English are pretty close. Most of the consonants are very similar. The vowels will make you crazy if you're learning English and you're a Spanish speaker and you think vowels have one and only one sound. They don't, not if you're speaking English. So there are all sorts of, and not to mention the semantics. They don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the morphology. They don't have an understanding because they're learning the language. So think about it. A kid who already knows the language has the phonology, a 5, 6, 7-year-old has the phonology. They've been speaking the language for 5 to 7 years, depending on when they spoke. They've been hearing it for 5 to 7 years. They know the semantics at the level of a 5, 6, 7-year-old. And think about the words that are used to teach these skills. The words that are used to teach beginning reading skills are typically words that are in the vocabulary of young 5, 6, 7-year-old English speakers. They're not necessarily in the vocabulary of English learners. And even if a 5 or 6-year-old doesn't know that ing is a suffix that turns a verb into a participle, right? They have no concept of that. They know intuitively what walking means. English learners will not necessarily know what walking means. They may know the verb walk, but what happens when you say walking? They might confuse that with waking. So you can't assume that they have the same phonological and semantic understanding of the language they are learning to read. And remember, you're making that brain circuitry, sound, symbol, meaning. English speakers, all they have to learn, and I say all in quotation marks, all they have to learn is the spelling system, right? That's what you're teaching them. Phonics, decoding, this letter sounds like this, there are irregularities. But the English learner's got to learn all three. They've got a tougher lift. But ladies and gentlemen, there's good news. And the good news is this, that learning to read in a language you are simultaneously learning is basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know. And why is that? After I carried on and made such a fuss about what a challenge it is for them, why is it basically the same? Well, because they involve similar networks of brain activation. The same thing has to happen. The same brain circuitry has got to be created. But language learners require additional supporting brain regions during learning because they have no or limited already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. Their brains require additional support in the regions of sound and meaning. So there's some good news. The good news is that it's basically the same. The more sobering news is that teachers have to think about how to support these additional brain regions during learning. Now, I'm speaking neurospeak, even though I'm not a neuroscientist, supporting brain regions. We don't think about supporting brain regions, for God's sake. We think about supporting students. So it's all well and good to support this region and that region, wherever it happens to lie, but we're teaching kids. Tell me what to do outside the brain. Well, there's some more good news. And that good news is two seminal studies that provide the best guidance that I know, kind of conceptually and operationally. It's not exactly a curriculum. In fact, one of the things that I complain about in a lot of the really good, quote, science of reading stuff that's out, letters and various other things, is that there's not enough support for English learners in terms of phonology that they're learning and semantics that they're learning. So we don't have that curriculum yet. I've been working with some folks to try to beef those up. It's a tough lift, as you might imagine, but these two studies provide the best guidance that I know of. Each of them began with a successful intervention for English speakers, and then they modified it to provide support for English learners. What happened was that the intervention that they modified to provided ample oral English instruction to support the English literacy instruction. This is the key concept here. It was an intervention because it was like a type 2 intervention, but I would generalize this to talk about tier 1 classroom instruction. That classroom instruction for ELs has to provide oral English instruction to support the English literacy instruction. That is the key concept here. And both studies produced moderate to strong effects. Not every kid was taken out. Some kids had to go on to tier 3 because we have no solution for everyone. We're still working on that. We have solutions for large numbers of kids, far more than we're actually implementing now, which is another story. But this produced very positive, both produced very positive results. And the citations are in the references, and I would strongly encourage you to take a look at them if you don't know. They're not really new studies, but they're not, especially among my English learner and bilingual education friends, they tend to ignore them or pretend they don't exist. I don't know what the deal is, but check them out. Again, they're behind a paywall, so email me and I'll be happy to send you the PDF. So let me tell you a little bit about these studies. They were both small group interventions, effective small group interventions. One was by Sharon Vaughn, whom I'm sure most of you have heard of, a really excellent, eminent researcher. And she began with an effective intervention for English monolingual struggling readers. Again, this is a tier 2 intervention for kids at risk. There's no dyslexia diagnosis. It's just kids who are having difficulty getting traction and warranted a tier 2 intervention. And the goal was fluent, meaningful reading. They used a direct instruction approach. They used phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, word recognition, text fluency, all the usual suspects. The activities including writing letters, sounding out, reading words, dictation, spelling, reading and rereading, decodable text, right? Nothing unusual here. This is right down the pike. But then for the English learners, they added language supports, right? Think about the neuroscientists saying, support those brain regions, support those brain regions. And the teacher say, okay, I'm going to support them. I'm going to support those brain regions. And they instituted 3 to 8 activities in each lesson For example, clarifying words and content with visuals, gestures, and expressions. You know this as like sheltered instruction or SIOP kind of strategies. They clarified and defined the words and the directions. You can't assume that an English learner is not going to know what trace or copy means, for example. They also highlighted 2 or 3 key vocabulary words and illustrated them. Some words are pretty easy to illustrate with pictures, others you can illustrate with actions. But the key words are these. The key words are the words that were being used to teach the skills. Because when it came to processing them visually, they wanted to make sure the kids understood them, that they were not just sort of decoding nonsense words. Think about it. If you don't know the meaning of a word, everything's a nonsense word, right? It may make sense to you, but that's because you understand the word. It's not nonsense to you. But if you're learning the language, any word that you don't understand is a nonsense word. And while there's some benefit to using nonsense words to test for decoding skills, right? You don't want to use nonsense words when you're teaching anyone to create that connection between sound, symbol, and meaning, right? When you're teaching that, you want to use real words. If you want to test for decoding skills, or what are sometimes called word attack skills, you can use nonsense words. Make sure you clarify to the kids that we're going to be reading some silly words. They don't mean anything, because kids are going to try to figure out what they mean if they're being taught correctly and if they have the right intuitive understanding. So if you use nonsense words, make sure you make it clear. These are silly words. These are goofy words. They sound funny. Otherwise, you're going to be really misleading them. But for English learners, the words that are being used to teach the skills, whether it's phonemic awareness or letter sound knowledge or decoding in particular, you want to make sure that those keywords are understood by the kids. You want to provide instruction in English language use with student responses. Vocabulary lessons, yes, but not just vocabulary, because you want them to be in their receptive and productive vocabulary. They want them to really absorb the word, especially the key words. Teachers use guided storytelling, retelling, and discussion, again, using the words. Sometimes the utterances that kids make were limited because they're learning language. Sometimes they're more extensive because they're at an intermediate level. At whatever level is appropriate, to make sure that you're making comprehensible the words and the text being used to teach them the reading skills. That's what I mean by oral language support that supports the literacy skills that you're teaching. Now, there was a later study by Linnea Airy who also added language support, got some good results. And I normally don't like to put so much text at one time, but this is, I think, the most important quote. If anyone were to ask me, what's the most important quote in the whole literature on reading and English learners? This would be it. I hope this is not all you read, but I want to draw your attention to this because I want to spend some time on it. One purpose of this intervention was to develop oral language by encouraging students to talk about the books and by explaining the meanings of new vocabulary words. These words were written in students' personal books, and the meanings were reviewed each time the book was read, okay? Oral language support, right? She's talking about how you're providing oral language. Now, what's the connection between that and teaching these foundational literacy skills? Here it comes. Students were encouraged to decode unknown words by relying on their letter sound knowledge. Okay, let me pause on this. First step here, encouraged to decode unknown words by relying on their letter sound knowledge, those foundational skills. First thing you do when you come across, and of course, I'm assuming that it's at the child's instructional level. You're not putting hypotenuse in front of them. You're putting words that are appropriate for beginning and early readers. You come across a word that you don't recognize, what's the first thing you do? You look at the letters. You try to decode what the word is by using your letter sound knowledge. That's the first thing you do. And then what do? Then you cross-check with meaning and pictures to confirm the identities of the words. Now, 2 points here. The most important being, if you don't know the meanings of the words, and if you don't know the context, even if you look at the pictures, you're not going to be able to really confirm. I mean, what's particularly deadly for this process is if you don't know the meaning of the word. How can you possibly determine or confirm the identity of the word. You can't say, oh, is this a word? Do I know it? Does it make sense here? That's what you want kids to do. But if they don't know the word, they can't do it. That's point number one. Point number two, this is not 3Qing. Even though there are cues involved here, there's letters, there's pictures, there's context. 3Qing, and I'm going to say some other things about it in a few minutes, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure to word recognition. Not a good idea. Some kids get it. I mean, I know for a fact kids who are in balanced literacy, whole language, 3Qing classrooms, and they figure out how to read, it happens. But by and large, particularly for English learners who are learning the language as they're learning to read and write it, you need something more structured, more explicit. And the best pathway to recognizing words is first through the letters and their corresponding sounds to decode them. But it's not the only thing, because you want to make sure that the context, that the word is a word, it has meaning, and it fits in the context. So you don't do it all together all at once. You first use your phonic decoding cues and then use context. I think of phonics and decoding as the on-ramp to word recognition. But you don't really recognize a word. Do a little morphological analysis. What is recognize? Re, meaning do it again. Cognize, know or understand. You can't recognize if you haven't cognized before. If you haven't seen or understood the word, you cannot recognize it. I mean, literally. So the decoding and letter sound knowledge is the on-ramp. It's the first pass, the first and best first pass at recognizing a word, but then you want to confirm or cross-check with meaning, including pictures. And this is true for English speakers as well. This would be the, quote, protocol of word recognition that I would advocate for teaching anyone. It's just that you need that additional consideration, that additional layer of supporting brain regions, supporting English learners by providing that oral language support. But it's the same thing that you're teaching English speakers to do as you're teaching them to read, but you're providing that additional support. Because kids who are English learners are learning three things. I think of it as a three-legged stool: sound, symbol, meaning. English speakers, they just got to learn the symbols and how they relate to semantics and sound. English learners got to learn all three of that three-legged stool. So here are the foundations for literacy, whether you're an English learner or an English speaker. First of all, you have to understand the alphabetic principle. You have to understand that spoken words comprise individual sounds. You have to understand the sound symbol system, which we call phonics. You have to understand that you recognize words by decoding first, with context and word meanings secondary. Always, always, always working toward automaticity and fluency. And the research that we have and the analysis that we've done, I'm sure one of the things that I admire Linnea Airy for, I admire her for many things, but her concept of orthographic mapping, which is once you follow this procedure, once you know letter sound knowledge, then you decode a word and you map that decoded word to its corresponding meaning. You map the sounds of the word to its written representation. That's orthographic mapping. And then that mapping gets mapped to the meaning of the word. When you do that several times, some kids, one-shot learning. Other kids, they need a lot of opportunity to engage in that orthographic mapping process. But once you do that a certain number of times, and for many or most kids, again, the range is enormous. That's where automaticity and fluency kicks in, and you have sight words. And one of the important, one of the most important things about becoming a proficient reader is develop an ever-growing basket of sight words, reading at the speed of sight, where you see it, you read it, you don't have to decode it anymore. Now, all of this is very important. Foundations are very important. But if all you have is a foundation, you haven't got much, right? I mean, this is a great foundation, but personally, I like my houses and buildings with rooms, bathroom, kitchen, and so forth. But a foundation is really important because without a foundation, you have trouble. Sometimes I mean, I drive across the country and I see these things, and I think I took a picture of this somewhere in the fields of Iowa or something. But usually without foundation, you have serious trouble, fatal trouble. If kids don't have a good foundation, they're in trouble. As simple and complex as that. But at the same time, developing as a reader involves many, many components. Knowing the sounds of the language and the letters that represent those sounds. Knowing that using letters and sounds to read and spell words, right? This, shall we say, is one road in my road metaphor from several slides ago. These are usually called foundational literacy skills, or they're usually referred to as phonics or decoding. Whatever you call them, they're best taught directly, explicitly, and systematically. That's the best prescription, shall we say. But there's this other road that we cannot forget. Understanding the roads, having the background knowledge to understand what you read, having sufficient language proficiency for comprehension. You need comprehension skills. You need metacognitive skills and executive functions. These others must be addressed as the first road is under construction. They have to be done at a distinct time so you don't clutter the landscape. That's one of the problems with a lot of the reading series that we have. They're just cluttered. There's just too much stuff there without enough direction or understanding of when you need to spend and how much time and what you need to do to develop the road to the code, shall we say. Someone else invented that, not me. But while you're doing that at one part of the lesson or the day, you've got to also be thinking about this other road, because eventually, what? Eventually they have to converge. Eventually that reading circuit's got to be constructed. Eventually kids have to be able to access visually their oral language. And the richer their oral language, the better their reading will be. But at the same time, the tighter the connections in that reading circuit, the better their reading will be. It requires all of these things to come together. All of these things to come together. And developing readers, knowing the sounds of the language, the code, and working on the other parts where the language becomes more robust and more robust. That's the best word for it, I think. They will converge to produce successful readers. So let me turn to, and then they go, of course, to the destination, which I've belabored my metaphor, so I apologize. And of course, the destination is literacy. So let me switch metaphors for the next few minutes. This is something I'm sure all of you are familiar with. My road to the code, it's kind of a ripoff of this. I like travel metaphors, but it's the same idea. That you have two distinct things going on. Call them buckets, call them paths, call them strands, call them whatever you want to call them. But you have word recognition here, which involves a certain set of processes, mental processes, cognitive and linguistic processes. But then you have also language comprehension, the other pathway. And they both become increasingly automatic, increasingly strategic, and they lead to skilled reading. Okay, so this is, I think, a pretty well-established metaphor. It's very, very rich, very resonant for me. And I think to get back to one of my driving themes, it applies to English learners as much as it applies to English speakers. But remember, we need to support those other regions of the brain in those children's heads. And so here is a visual representation of that I recently came up with many of you might know Linda Cavazos from Texas. She and I have been working together to try to represent visually, because we think the reading rope is a very rich, vibrant metaphor. that helps us really understand, even if metaphorically, what needs to go on. So we want to use that. But how do you represent the fact that English learners need additional brain regions supported? Well, we layer on to the strands of the reading rope two types of strands of oral language. We have the kind of strand that I've been talking about with oral language that supports each of these. This is identical. The visual is a little different, but the content is identical to the reading rope. You have language comprehension with background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge, the whole shot. And you got word recognition with the same things that are on in Scarborough's rope: phonological awareness, alphabetic principle, sight recognition, and so forth. But then you see these little yellow strands? That's English oral language development that is woven throughout to support the literacy development, because you're aiming for the same thing: skilled reading in English, in the second language, fluent execution and coordination of language comprehension and word recognition. And what I'm saying is that it's the same thing having to go on, but we need an additional layer of support to help kids who are learning the language helping them learn to read it as they're learning it. But there's another aspect to it, which is this shaft that goes through the middle here, which is oral language development more broadly defined. Because as important as this is, the little strands here, it's very, how should I say, it's kind of restricted, because it's restricted to specifically supporting the literacy. But if you only did oral language that was supporting the literacy, important, super important, but it'd be limited, because there's lots of other oral language development that English learners need that are not necessarily or directly tied to literacy development, but they need for full, I mean, think about what full proficiency means. Full proficiency means you can basically say and understand anything in the language that you're, cognitively capable of understanding, as long as you understand the concepts, the vocabulary, it's not too hard, and so on and so forth. So you need to think about oral language development in broader terms: second language acquisition, metalinguistic awareness, providing linguistic scaffolds, which is sort of the tools in the trade of second language acquisition as we normally think about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm adding are these strands here that are specifically geared to supporting literacy acquisition and literacy development. Oh, so let me just say one other thing before I leave this. So these are particularly important at the beginning, and I illustrated those with the two studies. They continue, but at some point, think about it. At some point, you want kids to become so proficient in English that what they read and they write, and this happens. I mean, this is actually a true fact. Once you can read with a certain degree of proficiency, that actually helps promote your language development, right? So initially, you need oral language development to support your literacy. But once you can read at a certain level, that itself will contribute to your literacy, your language development. So when things get really tight right here, you can learn and develop your language orally and literally. Literally, but with literacy, through literacy. Some people prefer oral, some people prefer, written. They're more visual, they're more oral, doesn't matter. But you can develop your language if you reach a certain level of literacy development. So at some point, they become intertwined. You can still separate them out if you want, but that's what you want to reach, that point where oracy and literacy, I should say oracy and literacy, are sort of interchangeable. We'll always have differences. We can hear at different speeds. We can read at different speeds. But you want to be so tightly woven that contributing to one contributes to the other. Okay, so what about after beginning and early literacy. So I'm going to close down. I mean, I know there's been a lot of content. It looks like I'm going to launch into a whole new segment, but rest assured, I'm not. I'm going to use my Netflix ending and leave you on a cliffhanger. Don't want you to fall off the cliff, but I want you to at least take a look. But it's the same basic idea that English learners need what everyone needs, what all of our kids need, plus additional language support. But, there are additional challenges. Why? Because English language proficiency and background knowledge become increasingly crucial for school success. The language demands of school become more and more difficult. I mean, think about it. I mean, I don't need to give you any research citations. After you hit maybe third, there's a reason there's this old cliche about learn to read, read to learn. It's a cliche, but there are elements of truth. And it gets to what I was saying a few minutes ago, that once you can read at a certain level, you can really learn stuff that previously you could only really learn by listening because your reading skills just weren't good enough. So it's a cliche and it's kind of hackneyed, but there's an element of truth to that. Unfortunately, sometimes people interpret that as meaning until you can read, you can't really learn anything. That is untrue. And obviously it's untrue. And that's why I emphasize that as you're teaching kids foundational literacy skills, word recognition and so forth, you also have to be working on language development, comprehension, and knowledge building. You don't want to wait till they can read to focus on that. Otherwise they'll get even more behind the eight ball than a lot of kids who come to school already are. So you want to make sure that you get on that path or on that rope. Choose your metaphor. Simultaneously, at the same time the child's development, but not necessarily at the same time of the day, because there are aspects of learning to read that require dedicated, systematic, comprehensive, focused instruction, uncluttered by other things that are important but are best learned and experienced at a different time. Now, you want to integrate those two to the extent you can, that's fine, but don't let the integration get in the way of providing the direct, systematic, explicit, and cumulative instruction that's needed to build that reading circuit. The reading circuit will thank you for it because you will come to the reading circuit with a richer language ability, skill, knowledge, and understanding, which will make that whole circuit more robust. But once you hit third, fourth grade, the expectations rise exponentially. Don't even get started on middle school and high school. School gets harder the higher up you go. And this is something in particular you need to pay attention to for your English learners. It gets harder for everyone. But think about it. For English learners, it gets particularly harder because they're still learning a language while they're learning to read and write and understand and develop academically in it. And literacy becomes increasingly dependent on higher levels of English proficiency. The knowledge of the world becomes increasingly important. That other road, as I'm afraid I've belabored by now, but I just got to say it one more time, the other road has to be addressed early on. You can't wait until the foundational skills have been acquired. That is a serious mistake. But, those foundational skills remain important. Why? Well, check out my PowerPoint and go through the rest of the deck and let me know what you think. So I'm going to stop it there. We've got 10 minutes, I think, Sharon, am I right? And I've seen some stuff on the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore anyone, but I was kind of involved here.
Yeah.
So if we have questions or things, Sharon, please let me know what you think would be good to discuss.
Absolutely. So if you have any specific questions for Claude at this time, this is a great chance for you to unmute and ask your questions related to what he's been talking about. We're also going to put feedback survey in the chat so that you can share with us your thoughts as well. So any questions that come to mind as we go through this content?
Let me just say, Sharon, so some people have asked me if I could send them stuff, and I'd be happy to, but please email me because I don't have your email address, and just email me at either email address. I have a Stanford one or a Gmail one. I get both of them. Oh, they're on my PowerPoint. So if you don't have it already, so just email me and I'm happy to send you whatever.
So Claude, are you seeing that question in the chat there?
Which one? I see a whole, let me see here.
So this is from Rachel. It says, so for children who are older, say class 5 coming into an English speaking school, would you say to
Ah,
start with phonics even though these children are older?
yeah. Okay, great. Well, a lot depends on the child's, I'm assuming we're talking about English learners. It depends on the child's, most have no English. Okay. It depends on the child's literacy level um, in their native language. I'm assuming it's none or very little if they're 5. They probably, in Mexico, for example, uh, Latin American countries, most are native in their native language. Native speakers, or do they have, Rachel, do they have literacy skills? Oh, class 5. Oh, class 5, I'm sorry. Oh, Rachel, you must be from England or something. Class 5, yes.
Yes, I am. I'm working in Germany.
Okay. Duly noted. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. So do they have literacy skills in their native language?
Yeah, most are fluent in their native language. They come in with Korean, Japanese, Chinese, but obviously have no English. So they're in classes with 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, unable to speak or read English. And we generally start down with phonics, keywords, sight words, toilet, drink, food.
In the
But
orally, you mean, not in writing.
orally, flashcards, pictures,
Okay.
and they pick it up really fast. But
Yeah.
obviously, when they're 10 and 11, going back to learning how to spell dog phonetically, sometimes they fight back. So it's just about whether there's a better way of doing it rather than going right back down to the phonics, or if that is still the best way to move forward.
Right. Great question. So let me separate it in two. First of all, I mean, particularly as kids get older, motivational issues become really a pain in the neck. That's why I used to teach junior high, then I taught first grade. Guess which one I like more? You're very intuitive, Rachel. But the fact is that in order to read in a language, you have to know, you have to connect the sound, symbol, and meaning. I mean, there's just no getting around it. And part of the, how should I say, the mystery, the art, the magic of teaching is figuring out ways to motivate kids who don't want to do something. So, I know I don't want to sound glib, but that's an issue that we face as teachers. Um, and somehow we have to figure out a way to motivate them. But they do have to, so they have literacy skills. Now, a lot depends, Korean is an alphabetic language. Some of the others, like depending on what they're reading in Japanese or Chinese, are morphosyntactic or they're idea logographic. But they have the idea of reading. Do you find a difference in the acquisition of English literacy between kids who come from a language that are alphabetic versus kids who come from a language where the written language is not? Do you find any difference there?
No, not generally. Maybe I could look further into that, but I haven't noticed anything particularly, no.
Yeah. Well, I would check that out because the kids who come from an alphabetic language have the alphabetic principle, assuming they're reading at some, I mean, if they're from Korea and 10 years old and have been in school, my guess is they're pretty good Korean readers. I mean, they're not, yeah, they've been in school. It's really different when their kids are not in school or they've interrupted schooling or that's a different ball game. But these kids are fully literate. So they have the idea of the alphabetic principle, which is something you want to sort of tap into and help them transfer that knowledge, that intuitive, which is now intuitive because they learned it. They weren't born knowing it, but learning to read. Now they kind of say, well, yeah, obviously the letters sound like this, and you sound it out. They know how to sound things out in Korean. You say, well, it's the same trick you got to learn in English. So if you want to learn to read in English, you got to know what the words mean and how the letters sound. I mean, that's kind of like the bottom line. My guess is it would be more challenging for kids who come from, Chinese or, most languages are alphabetic, 90%, I think. And so the transfer there should be more direct. There's still going to be motivational issues. There are always motivational issues. But my guess is that it'll be an easier transfer if you make the connection that what you know how to do in Korean, so you read Korean, we're going to help you do in English. It's the same thing. You just got to learn these letters and their sounds. Boom. And you got it. For kids in Chinese, my guess is it would be a little more challenging because they've got to learn a concept, an alphabetic principle. But I would still try to build on what they know and say, okay, here's how it works in Chinese. You know how to do it. Well, yeah, awesome. We're going to help you learn how to do that in English, but English is kind of weird. It works differently. This symbol doesn't stand for an idea. It stands for a sound. So I would work on the transfer of what they already know to what they need to know and understand to make it work in English. I mean, that would be the concept.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Probably have time for one more question if
Oh,
there's.
sorry, that was so long.
No, you're totally fine. You're totally
great
fine.
question.
It was a great question and a great response. Time for maybe one more question before we are finished. If anybody else has something they'd like to ask.
I guess I answered all questions. That's awesome.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we are so grateful that you joined us today to be part of this presentation. And thank you so much, Claude, for sharing your thinking and your expertise this morning.